Study number 2 I want to talk to you about a little bit, I'm sure many of you know something about, is the wonderful work by Dick Nisbett and his associates, particularly Dov Cohen, on cultures of honor. Because although Nisbett and his associates weren't in fact motivated by the philosophical question, I think their findings and their very careful methodology provides important evidence on this question of, is moral disagreement fundamental? Much of what I'm going to be talking about, by the way, is summarized in this delightful book. I'll come back to it in a minute or two. I think in many ways it's a paradigm of how to do interdisciplinary cognitive science. Cultures of Honor was published about 10 years ago, I think. All right, well, let me tell you a little bit about cultures of honor to get started. It's a complicated phenomenon, but for our purposes, we can focus on just one aspect of the phenomenon. Here's what Nisbett and Cohen tell us. They say a key aspect of the culture of honor is the importance placed on the insult and the necessity to respond to it. An insult implies that the target is weak enough to be bullied. Since a reputation for strength is of the essence in the culture of honor, the individual who insults someone must be forced to retract. If the instigator refuses, he must be punished with violence or even death. Well, one of the things that was independently known from the anthropological literature is that cultures of honor tend to arise, in fact, cultures of this sort have arisen all over the world in particular situations, namely situations where resources are liable to theft, and the state or the community's coercive apparatus is insufficiently strong to prevent people from having their resources stolen or to punish the thief. Now, these conditions arise under a number of circumstances. Perhaps the most widely discussed is in relatively remote areas where herding is the main form of viable agriculture. And of course, it's the, as it were, portability of herd animals. Very easy to steal a goat or a camel, a lot harder to steal an olive grove, okay? So the portability of herd animals makes them prone to theft, and the remoteness makes it difficult for the police, if there are any, to punish the thieves. But cultures of honor also typically arise in urban inner city areas. Notoriously, many of the black ghettos in the United States are in fact or characterized by cultures of honor. Many of the same features you see in traditional cultures of honor arise quite independently in those settings. Well, an important feature about cultures of honor, and I think a crucially interesting one, not only for our purposes, but for other purposes as well, things that have nothing to do with our topic today, but have to do with cultural evolution, is that cultures of honor exhibit remarkable cultural inertia. They tend to persist for generations after the conditions that gave rise to them disappear. So after people, for example, stop being anything like herders. And what Nisbett and Cohen argue in that Cultures of Honor's book is that the American South, or at least parts in particular, parts of the white population of the American South, to this day, or to 10 years ago when the work was done, are in fact cultures of honor. Well, the American South was originally settled by Scotch-Irish herders who had a long tradition of culture of honor. And, as I say, Nisbett and Cohen devote much of their book to defending the case that a culture of honor persists among white Southerners today. Okay? And it's here, I said earlier, I thought this was an ideal example of how interdisciplinary work in the cognitive sciences should be done. Let me say a little bit about the kinds of evidence that they marshal, because they do I think, spectacularly good job of marshalling evidence from a wide variety of disciplines, including demographic data that indicate that amongst Southern whites, homicides are more common in regions where herding was once itself common. Okay? Also, white males in the South are much more likely than white males in other regions to be involved in homicides resulting from arguments, but interestingly, they're not more likely to be involved in homicides resulting from robberies or other sorts of felonies. So the take-home message, if you're traveling in the American South here, is don't diss a white guy. Right? You're no more likely in the South than in the North to be shot in the stick-up of a convenience store, but you diss a white guy, you insult a white guy, you may get your head blown off. Okay, they also look at survey data, indicating that white Southerners are much more likely to believe claims like violence is extremely justified in response to a variety of affronts. And they're also much more likely to agree to claims like, if a man fails to respond violently to an insult, particularly an insult to his woman, he is not much of a man. Okay? They also look at legal scholarship, indicating that in the southern states, the laws give more freedom for the use of violence for people defending themselves and their property. And particularly interesting, I think, is the work, their own research, rather than merely their assembly of data from pre-existing literature. And I'll only have time to tell you about two fascinating bits, one a field study and the other a series of lab experiments. In the field study, letters were sent to hundreds of potential employers around the United States, both in the North and in the South. The letters purported to be job applications. They said, I'm moving to your area, I'm writing to find out whether you have a job available for me. They purported to be from a 27-year-old Michigan man, it's an American state, who had one blemish on his otherwise very solid record. Here is the way one version of the letter explained the blemish. I've been convicted of manslaughter. I got into a fight with someone who was having an affair with my fiancé. He confronted me in front of my friends at a bar, told everyone that he and my fiancé were sleeping together, laughed at me to my face, and asked me to step outside if I was man enough, and in the ensuing fight, the other guy was killed. The other letter explained that the applicant had stolen a couple of expensive cars at a time when his family particularly needed money. Well, the Southern employers that Nisbett and Cohen wrote to were much more likely to be sympathetic in response to the manslaughter incident than the car theft incident, but car theft letter. But there was no similar disparity in the Northern employers. And just to give you some idea of what we're talking about in terms of, these were independently coded and what have you, but here's one example of what it is to be sympathetic. Remember, this is somebody who killed somebody in a parking lot fight. As for your problems in the past, anyone could probably be in the situation you were in. It was just an unfortunate incident that should not be held against you. Your honesty shows you are sincere. I wish you the best of luck for the future. You have a positive attitude and a willingness to work. These are qualities that businesses look for in potential employees. No Northern employer was anywhere nearly so sympathetic. Okay, well, let me now tell you about the laboratory study. These were conducted on white, male, mostly upper middle class students, undergraduate students at the University of Michigan, and these students were some from the North and some from the South, so some culture of honor and some not, if this hypothesis is correct. So subjects were told initially, we're going to take a saliva sample to measure blood sugar before you perform a variety of tasks. So saliva sample is taken, then they walk down a long hall, and in this long, narrow hall, there is a Confederate, a big football player who's trained to play this role, and the Confederate bumps into the person, apparently accidentally, and then mumbles very loudly under his breath, "asshole." Okay. After that, they get to the other end of the hall, a second saliva sample is taken, and the saliva samples are tested for cortisol, which is associated with stress, and for testosterone, which is associated with dominance behavior and aggression. And this is one of my favorite slides ever. As you can see here, the northern non-culture of honor subjects basically didn't react at all, and the southerners had a surge of testosterone and a surge of cortisol, and we're talking now in seconds, right, 30 seconds after the bumping. Well, I'm inclined to think that these findings suggest that moral attitudes about the appropriateness of violence in response to insults will not converge even under idealized circumstances, and that therefore these kinds of disagreements are in fact fundamental, in my terms, moral disagreements. To see why, I mean, the data don't immediately speak for themselves, since they weren't designed to test this hypothesis, but consider some of the standard, what's often called in the literature, defusing explanations, explanations of that could be used by a moral realist to argue, yes, there's disagreement, but it's not really fundamental. Okay? Well, one kind of disagreement, one kind of move is that the disagreement is really caused or sustained by disagreement about relevant non-moral facts. Indeed, this is really the big weapon of the moral realist in trying to rebut cases like this. But in these cases, it's hard to see what those non-moral facts might be. In particular, the one that you might think of first, namely religious disagreements, we know to be false. There were no systematic religious differences between the northern population and the southern population. Nor is there any reason to think, I mean, maybe this isn't a serious suggestion, but could it be that the northerners don't know that being called an asshole is an insult? No, although we don't have data for that. I'm just speculating. Okay. Now, of course, it's always possible that there's an unsuspected systematic difference in belief between these two populations. So even the 3 or 4 or 5 bits of data that Nisbett and Cohen assembled don't begin to exhaust the possible disagreements that might be lurking there. But I think at this point, the burden of argument surely falls squarely on those who want to deny that the moral disagreements about the appropriateness of violence between culture of honor folks in the American South and non-culture of honor folks in the American North is people who want to deny that that disagreement is fundamental. Well, another diffusing explanation that might be suggested here is that one group or other fails to be impartial. Remember, it's factual disagreement or non-moral disagreement, partiality or irrationality. Those are the big three in characterizing idealized circumstances. But as John Doris and Alex Plakia say in a recent paper, there seems no reason to think that the Southerners' economic interests are more served or are served by being quick on the draw, while Northerners' economic interests are served by turning the other cheek. There looks to be no obvious partiality here. It looks to be the wrong notion to apply to. Well, what about irrationality? Could it be that one group or the other is irrational? Here, of course, we have a hotly contested notion. And in particular, there are both thin and thick accounts of rationality. On a thin account of rationality, and of course, spelling this out in detail is a major project, but on a thin account of rationality, it's tied to logic, probability, decision theory. So you are thinly rational to the extent that your belief formation and your decision making coheres with the principles of logic, probability theory, statistics, decision theory. Thick rationality, on the other hand, is a harder notion to characterize, but there are apparently, I don't believe there is such a thing as thick rationality. I think it's a confused notion, but the people who invoke this notion think that there are certain kinds of preferences which, regardless of the reason for them, are intrinsically irrational. Well, it's, I think, singularly implausible that the Northerners and the Southerners disagree on thin rationality. There's absolutely no reason to suspect that. They might, of course, disagree on thick, they might, of course, differ on rationality if you have a thick interpretation of rationality, because, after all, Southerners voted for George Bush, and that indicates that they are obviously irrational. But of course, as this example illustrates, thick interpretations of rationality are themselves normatively loaded, so in this debate, they're question-begging.